Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the report. The child abuse scandal in Rotherham has shocked the nation, but with the focus on men. Sarah Saeed has been exploring how the issue affects Muslim women.
The horrific scale of child abuse in Rotherham was revealed to us last week in an independent inquiry. According to the report into abuse, as many as 1,400 girls were sexually exploited between 1997 and 2013.
While media coverage has been focusing on how gangs of mainly Asian descent have been preying on white female victims, what's largely been ignored are the findings that sexual abuse actually exists within Asian communities and is largely underreported.
Alexis J., the author of the report, raised a number of points regarding the sexual abuse of victims from ethnic minority communities. She said the board should address as priority the underreporting of exploitation and abuse in minority ethnic communities. She goes on to conclude that one of the myths being propagated is that only white girls are victims of sexual exploitation by Asian or Muslim males.
When I think about my childhood, it's very difficult to remember good times. When everyone else was playing and laughing, I was being sexually abused. I don't know when it started. All I can remember is different men doing disgusting things to me. I didn't know what to do. Who do I turn to? I didn't have the words to explain to my parents that these men were hurting me, making me do things that wanted to make me vomit.
Making the problem worse is when sexual abuse goes unreported. This is a common response when it occurs within Asian communities, where the issue is still a cultural taboo.
You know, there is this whole issue around honour and shame within families. So the whole thing around if a young girl is sexually abused, young as in a child or a young woman, it's about, you know, how can they basically hide that to save face, because that girl or the girls in the family won't be able to get married. The whole thing around the kind of honour lies with women in the family, unfortunately. So therefore, if something happens to those women or those girls, then it's the whole family affected.
I think I tried to tell my mum once. She told me to be quiet and that he was one of my uncles from the community and these were respectable people. From that day, I never told a soul.
And what has been the response from the community when you've been kind of trying to raise these issues?
I mean, just in the last week, I've been doing a lot of TV interviews, and I think people want to understand more about the issue. They're aware of it, but they want to be involved. They want, for example, mosques to kind of take more action, in the sense talk about it, possibly in khutbahs, for community leaders to actually say, we want, you know, we are going to do something to kind of support women. So young people are actually saying, you know, what can we do? I think the taboo slowly is going to be broken, and with the kind of sexual exploitation issues that have come out, everybody is kind of saying, what is this? What is this phenomenon? People want to find out. So I'm hoping that there will be some action and not just talk.
What these reports have revealed is that neither the victims nor the perpetrators are specific to one culture. The issue is complex and will require an appropriate response in order to deal with the issue of sexual abuse against children of all backgrounds. Sarah Say, The Report.
Now remaining in the studio to discuss this, Mushfique Uddin, director of the Khalil Foundation, and also with us now, Faeza Khan, a founding and executive member of Chayn, a volunteer-led startup empowering women to become independent. Thank you for joining us, Faeza, and of course staying with us, Brother Mushfique. Faeza, can I come to you first? Why is there so much silence, and why is it such a taboo?
There's no real clear answer to that question. There are many cultural and societal pressures faced by women, and especially girls, particularly in Muslim communities, where, as we briefly saw in the documentary, that the taboo of shame that's faced by communities and is very stark, and our girls often shy away from confiding or coming out in the open simply because they're discouraged by sometimes their own family members, or outside of it, they don't necessarily find the support. Quite often you also find that victims are isolated by communities. If they do speak out, they face stark isolation, which then makes it more difficult and lonelier for them. We have seen examples in recent press where people have come out, and it's almost like seeing a precedent, and there's an increasing awareness of women speaking out.
Are things about to change?
Yes, I think things are about to change.
Okay, Mushfique, earlier in the year we saw this massive summit, End Sexual Violence in Conflict. Now, we're not talking about conflict zones, we're talking about right here in Britain. Now, in countries like ours, why is this such a big issue? And as we just saw, why is it still such a taboo to talk about?
I think there's some issues that are taboo within Asian communities, whether they're Muslim, non-Muslim, Hindus, Sikhs, anybody from the subcontinent. There are some cultural issues that have been transported over from, those areas when people came here. You're talking about abuse of girls, there's abuse of boys. And what's shocking is that this was so recent. I mean, we hear all these reports like Jimmy Savile and stuff happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but this is 1997 to 2004 or something. Right. So it's like, it is really shocking. It's really close to home. I think we've got to take faith out of it. These people happen to be Muslim. They're just scum, and they're paedophiles, and they should be treated in that way. There is a cultural problem of especially in Asian and certain Asian communities, Pakistani, for example, where people don't report. Or people brush it under the carpet because of family honour, and I think it's a real crime. And as Muslims, we need to understand that we have to answer to Allah. So if you got away with abuse here, on the Day of Judgment, you're going to have to answer the question. I've actually come across people, even in the Bengali community, who've been abused, and it's always usually people close to them, and it traumatises people for life. I guess we've got to accept that this is a problem. It affects all communities, black, white, Asian, Chinese, whatever. And what we can do as community leaders is try to deal with them. And often people have suspicions about people, or they know who these perpetrators are. And I think there's a new law coming in that if you knew about abuse and didn't report it in certain areas, that's a crime as well. So that might help.
Faeza, the conversation often orientates around the abuser rather than the abused. Your organisation is there to empower women to come out. Women are often the subjects of abuse in these cases. At the summit earlier this year, one of the things that came up was impunity for these crimes. Is it because there's such a low conviction rate in dealing with crimes of sexual violence that women don't come forward because they don't think the perpetrators of abuse will be held to account?
I think it's primarily a confidence problem. Absolutely. Quite often, as my colleague mentioned here, Khalil mentioned here, that quite often what's shocking is that some of these crimes that are being committed, they're being committed in communities where there is an expectation of justice. So the Rochdale crimes and similar abuses in Derbyshire earlier this year, we're faced with a community where there is an expectation that there will be justice. However, whether you belong to a white community or a British community or a Muslim community, some of the cultural and the social barriers faced by communities are all the same. And quite often the victims are silenced either by family members or by simply the inaction of authorities in place, or it was just the issue, the gravity of this as an issue was not recognized when it should have been. Sexual violence particularly is an issue which has previously for decades it's gone ignored. We haven't seen, it's a massively underreported crime across countries, across the continents, both in conflict, as we saw in the summit, and beyond, even within in non-conflict, fairly peaceful, developed territories such as the Great Britain.
Mushfique, post Rochdale, we saw a number of people come forward to talk about these cases. A lot of the time, one of the things that came about this shame culture, where families are telling people not to come forward, not to point out people who have abused them. How do we get over the shame culture?
There is no shame. If somebody does something to you, you should report it. If they abuse you or do dhulm, like oppress you in whatever way. I mean, there's lots of emotional abuse as well. In Asian cultures, there's loads of emotional abuse. We're talking about physical abuse here. So people have to be empowered to report the abuse and deal with it. We're not living in India or you know, where as we still hear, you know, women get the tribal elders or something, you know, that they serve out these punishments.
We've heard a number of cases in India.
So some of the first generation probably still have that mindset and then passes on to the next generation. I think there's a lot of work that's been done, but child abuse is a massive problem nationwide. You know, it's come to highlight because Rotherham, you know, there happens to be a large ethnic minority community of Pakistani origin there, but it doesn't mean that it's specific to Rotherham. It happens in all communities, all areas, you know. It's an ongoing problem, and whatever tools and methodologies adopted by the government or people there to protect children, the Muslims have to take that on board and adopt it and use it to protect children. It's our duty.
Well, one of the things that did come up from that report was the fact that a lot of people, because it was young white girls who mentioned, and a lot of media coverage came about that, but one of the things that came up from the report was that a lot of young Muslim women were also abused, but the fact that they didn't come forward, this didn't end up being discussed. So obviously we are seeing that this is a nationwide problem and not just specific to one culture or group, but what can organisations be doing to support those people being abused?
I think there's a whole issue with the Muslim community engaging with the young Muslims in this country, right from children, you know, if they attend mosques or they attend supplementary schools. A lot of the supplementary schools are now picking up and they have child protection policies in place and stuff like that. And then just making the community aware that this problem exists. We can't live in denial. I think we do tend to live in denial over certain issues, and this is an issue we can't deny. If we know about it, you know, we've got to come forward, and if we are still thinking that it doesn't happen, it does happen. It happens in all communities, including us.
And absolutely, just building on that, we must equip our young adults and our communities with the understanding that you must under any circumstance stand up for what are your rights. You must understand and appreciate that you are an individual and you have rights, and that framework of self-care almost takes precedent over any voice any community may have. Quite often our voices are drowned by the voices of this big bad community that we perceive. And the problem, as quite rightly pointed out, is not just in, yes, these are British communities living in, these are Indian or Pakistani communities, Asian communities living in Britain. And we just pointed out how in tribal areas in the India or in the Pakistan, sometimes ignorance of those communities leads to fairly unfair and brutal punishments meted out to the women, particularly of that community. But it then comes to a culture of ignorance. And that's a fundamental issue that we face both again, and I find that this is absolutely fundamentally not restricted to the Asian communities, where there is a culture of ignorance amongst the people, the youth of today, of understanding what your rights are, what you can speak out for. This is changing, clearly it's changing, and we have had recent incidents where we've had both Asian women and young British women who've spoken out against their perpetrators, and that's encouraged others to speak out. But it's I think an absolute fundamental priority for communities to raise that awareness and understanding of an individual's liberties and rights in such a context.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us for that very important discussion, but unfortunately that's all we've got time for this evening. Thank you to my guests, and thank you at home for watching. Remember, you can keep up with our Twitter conversation on all tonight's stories by tweeting us at Islam Channel using the hashtag #TheReport. We're back on Monday evening at the same time, but for now we'll leave you with some scenes from an RAF display on the second day of the NATO summit. We'll be back next week, but until then, good night.